Hi guys, so I am so delighted to be here chatting today with Dr. James DiNicolantonio. Just to give everyone a little introduction to you, you are a cardiovascular research scientist and a doctor of pharmacy and an internationally renowned scientist in the field of health and nutrition. And also the author of this amazing book I just read called The Salt Fix. Can you tell us a little bit more about the need that we have for salt and why it's so important?
That's a great question. So salt is composed of two essential minerals. One of them is sodium and the other half of salt is chloride. And so basically we can't produce those essential minerals in the body, so we have to get them through diet. And because of that, our cravings for salt are driven by our bodies, and we should really trust that craving, whereas the other white crystal sugar, that craving is more of like a dependency rather than a need.
So with everyone being so scared of having salt, and I'm just surrounded by people who are on either a no salt diet or a low salt diet, and yet they're happily eating sugar. Like my mum, who has sky high blood pressure, and she doesn't put any salt in her cooking. Even my husband just went for a health check, and for no apparent reason, he was given a clean bill of health, but his doctor said you must cut the salt. So it seems like everywhere I go, the mantra is be careful with salt and cut the salt. And yet what you're saying is that we will sort of regulate that ourselves in a natural way, whereas with sugar, that craving is not a true craving. Is that what you're saying? It's different.
Yeah, the cravings are different. One is out of like a biological need, so we don't die, which is obviously our drive to consume salt, because we have to keep a really narrow range of salt levels in our blood. So sodium and chloride are kept within a very narrow range, because if they go out of a certain narrow range, it can kind of shift water in and out of cells, and that can eventually lead to swelling in the brain and death if you have too low of a sodium level in the blood. So our bodies make sure that there is this set intake for optimal health, and also that we're getting enough so we don't become deficient and eventually, perish.
Gosh, okay. And how would a person know if they were perhaps a little deficient in salt, that they weren't getting enough? What sorts of symptoms might they experience?
Yeah, so the most common symptom would be salt cravings. They're going to crave more salt, and they're just going to have this inherent drive to eat more salt. But there's also like actual symptoms that people are suffering from that can be due to salt deficiency, and they don't even realize it. And so some of the more common symptoms of salt deficiency is people will experience dizziness and lightheadedness, either when working out or when going from like a seated or a standing position too quickly. And there's also a syndrome called POTS. It's very common in women. It stands for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, where they get a really big rise in heart rate when they go from a seated to a standing position. And I've had people tell me if they consume salty pickle juice right when they have that bout of increase in heart rate, it almost instantly improves their symptoms, and the heart rate can go down and the dizziness goes away. And it's very, very common in women, and over 3 million people in the United States alone have POTS. And then there's probably at least double that for people who have this orthostatic, what's called hypotension, or low blood pressure and dizziness when going from a seated to a rising position too quickly.
Okay. So how is it, given what you've just said, that this mantra, this dogma of, salt is the enemy, how did this come to be? Because, my daughter was saying to me the other day, she's only 11, and I was telling her it's fine to put more salt. And she said, Mummy, you told me for years that salt is poison, and I suddenly read this book and you've completely changed your tune. And I was like, yeah, I kind of have. And she said, well, what if this book's wrong? And, so what do you have to say to people who are it's ingrained in their head that salt is dangerous? How did we come to get it wrong? And kind of what proof is there that it's actually okay to eat salt?
Sure. So I think we need to remember that we are salty people. We're basically walking oceans. So our blood is very salty. Our interstitial fluid is very salty. That is the fluid that bathes all of our cells in the body. Our organs are salty. I mean, we sweat out salt, we cry salt, and we bleed salt. And so if we lose our internal oceans, that is a big problem. And we have to constantly fight to maintain our own saltiness. And so what I would say for people who are scared about consuming too much salt is, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, what we used to consume as a Paleolithic diet for 3 million years, we would consume the whole animal. That included the salty blood, the salty interstitial fluids, and the organs. We don't get that really anymore, even when we're eating a real food diet. And so we need to add the salt back. And the other kind of point that I like to make is some of the longest living people in the world, like Japanese and South Koreans, they consume an extremely high amount of salt. And so if we want to live long, it's pretty obvious that salt isn't something that's going to prevent us from living long or a healthy life.
Yeah. I mean, if I think of like kimchi and, all the pickles, this is so salty. And as you just said, they eat a lot of that stuff, don't they? In you mentioned, was it South Korea?
Yeah. I mean, that's the point, right? Is that I'm not telling people to consume processed foods with high amounts of salt. We need to eat real foods and use real types of healthy salts to bring back into our diet.
Okay. Because if I think back, when my kids were little, I used to, if I was making chicken soup, I would take out the chicken and the vegetables and put it in the liquidizer before I would add salt. We were just so, we were so careful to the point of being paranoid about not giving any salt at all to the babies. And then I remember going on holidays to France and buying baby food like the pureed vegetable and being very, very shocked and horrified because there was salt in all the baby food in France, which we thought was like, oh my gosh, it's so irresponsible. But now I've kind of read the book and like, well, maybe they were sensible and we got it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, salt is our most natural preservative, but we've been kind of ingrained that salt is so bad, we're almost willing to accept a more artificial preservative and think that that's okay rather than salt. But it's really, we've just been brainwashed for over 40 years because it's an essential mineral. And so we shouldn't really fear that.
Okay. And when you talk about, you mentioned different types of salt. Now, I was always told that table salt is poison, but that a very pure sea salt, or say Himalayan pink salt, which I use because I like the taste of it, is fine and it's full of minerals, and that's okay. But to avoid anything that says table salt, is that right, or is it all fine?
Yeah, I think it's partially right. I think that getting salt, even from table salt, is better than not getting enough, because there are severe harms from becoming deficient in salt. And so I would much rather consume table salt and get, not even just maintaining a state where I'm not becoming deficient, but also an optimal level. I'm totally fine with consuming table salt. But in that being said, if I can consume a more natural salt, I absolutely believe that it is a lot healthier. And some of the reasons are because table salt does have dextrose in it. It does have some anti-caking agents. It's bleached white, and it's not sourced from like a really pure salt source. So my two favorites, if you go and you look in my kitchen, the salts that I use are Redmond Real Salt and Ancient Lakes Magnesium Salt. And both of those salts are from an ancient ocean. So what that means is, if you're getting a sea salt like Celtic salt from a modern day ocean, that can have heavy metals and micro and nanoplastics in it. I mean, there's been tests done. Whereas these ancient sources, obviously an ancient lake formed 3 million years ago, isn't going to have that type of contamination.
Okay, great. So for people who have been told expressly by their doctor that they have high blood pressure and they must avoid salt, like my mum, who doesn't put any salt in anything. And I mean, for me, food is it's barely edible without salt. It's just, for me, it's what makes food palatable. And actually, I'm quite liberal with my salt in cooking. What would I begin to say to my mum, who is very scared of salt? What could you give me anything that I could sort of explain to her?
So I think for someone who, like your mom or my parents, what matters to them is you know, not only quality of life and being able to taste their food, but also things that are important to them, like cognitive function and bone health. And so sodium allows vitamin C to come into the bone and also into the brain. And so literally, if you deplete an animal of salt, they can't go through mazes as well as if they're given normal amounts of salt. And partially that is because sodium is driving vitamin C into the brain, and vitamin C in the brain has very, very important roles. And so cognitive decline and potentially decline in bone health can be caused by not getting enough salt. And so that's something that you could say to your mom, in that this is an essential mineral. And if you're not getting enough, you're not able to put vitamin C into your bones and into your brain as well if you just completely cut out salt from the diet.
Okay, so she does have weak bones and has broken her hip just by falling on a carpet. And unfortunately, I also have pretty weak bones. I never ever thought of salt as being something which had anything to do with my bone health. So thank you so much for that. So I wanted just to tell you a story which I think is going to be very, very interesting to you, because when I read the book and I read about this innate need and the lengths that animals will go to get hold of salt, the first thing I thought about was a story I was told a few years ago by a lady. She's now 88. She lives in Manchester. She's called Bobby Newman, and she's an Auschwitz survivor. And back in 1945, she was 16. And she left Auschwitz on a death march. So on this death march, most of the people around her just collapsed and died or were shot if they fell behind. And all they ate was snow. So she arrived at a kind of military barracks where they kind of just hoarded them, those who were still alive. And she had typhoid. She was a bag of bones. She couldn't sleep on the bunk at night because her bones were jutting into the wood. Covered in lice, just in the most appalling state, and hadn't really eaten anything but sort of scraps of potato skin and snow for a very long time. And she had to dig trenches. And she was there one day and she saw a German spoke to her and asked her how old she was. And she suddenly, I don't know, it came upon her to ask this man, tomorrow, come back with a packet of salt and I will give you something. Now, when she was in Auschwitz, she was responsible for sorting out all the clothes of the people who were gassed. And one day she came upon a beautiful silk dressing gown. And her and her friends noticed that the buttons weren't quite lined up. And in fact, they found a diamond was sewn into each sort of button area. So she had 2 diamonds with her at this point that she was in the military barracks. The man brought a packet of salt and she gave a diamond for some salt. And she just took the salt to her friends and they sat there and they just ate the salt like that, and she felt immediately better. And when I heard the story the first time, I couldn't believe it. Seemed such an insane thing that she wouldn't ask for food, that she'd ask for a packet of salt. And I actually went to see her this week just to corroborate the details. And she said, I don't know why I asked for salt. It was just such a craving in me that was the thing that I wanted in exchange for this diamond. And she felt better. She did slip into unconsciousness a couple of days later. She was put in a pile of bodies, but she slipped out in this mountain of dead bodies. She slipped out and a Russian soldier found her, and she's here to tell the tale today. But I just thought it was such an extraordinary thing. She's an incredible lady, incredible. And I just thought I would tell you that. So. Wow,
that is an incredible story. Like kind of blown away from it, honestly. And kind of the science behind that is we can survive. Some people have survived an entire year without eating food, but when we fast and we don't get food, we lose a ton of salt out the urine. For some reason, the kidneys can't hold on to salt very well in a fasted state. And it's probably because insulin levels go down so low, and insulin helps the kidneys actually retain salt. And so, people need salt. And Gandhi created a march for the British salt tax because people were literally dying in the heat because they were sweating out so much salt. And so there is that internal craving. Salt was called white gold for a long time. And, African princes and kings traded gold for salt on a 1-to-1 ratio. And so that kind of struck me as when you mentioned the diamond, people are willing to trade precious metals for salt. That is our precious metal that we need.
Yeah. And of course, the word salary comes from salt. The Roman soldiers were paid in salt.
Correct. Yeah.
So are you saying then that our message to people should be to trust this internal kind of thermostat? And if they feel that they want to add more salt to their food, that they should just kind of go with it because their body knows best?
Yeah. I mean, I can't give personal health advice, but there is this internal craving for salt. And I think it is a very bad idea to consciously restrict your salt intake. If you go against your cravings for salt, that could potentially be a problem. You might just become so deficient that it could honestly lead to catastrophic type of events. Okay,
gosh. And you mentioned in your book a couple of things in our modern lifestyle which can lead to us leaching salt. So one is our intake of coffee. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so most people kind of view coffee as like a mild diuretic. A lot of people understand that they increase their volume of urine when they consume coffee. But most people don't know that actually it is a much larger waster of salt. In fact, it causes even more loss of chloride than sodium in the urine. But you can lose up to a full teaspoon of salt in just 4 hours in the urine by consuming 4 cups of coffee. And the half-life of coffee is over 5 hours. So you can imagine if you're consuming coffee all day and slowly kind of losing salt in the urine, you can become deficient in salt very quickly.
So the other thing you mention in the book is that when people exercise a lot, they can unwittingly get very low in salt. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, when we exercise, our body's way to regulate its temperature is to sweat, and that helps cool us off. And we actually sweat out a tremendous amount of salt. And the average person is probably going to lose about a half a teaspoon of salt per hour of exercise through sweat. And honestly, I've seen studies going out for 8 hours where the salt concentration in sweat, it doesn't go down. So you can literally be losing a half a teaspoon of salt every single hour that you're exercising in, even moderate temperatures, like maybe 85 degrees, you can be losing about a half a teaspoon of salt every hour of exercise through sweat. And we also lose other minerals in sweat that most people don't even realize. Like iodine is probably our second largest mineral that we lose in sweat. And so only certain healthy salts kind of have that iodine. And a lot of people who are exercising are constantly sweating out salt and iodine and not replacing it. And that can lead to hypothyroidism, and it can reduce your metabolism, and you can start storing fat just because you're becoming iodine deficient by all the iodine you're losing in your sweat.
Whoa. It's just so huge, isn't it? And yet so few people know about this. So I just would urge people to read the book because it's all in here. And tell us, James, how can people find you and kind of buy the book? Do you have, is there a website that you can direct people to?
Yeah, so people can order the book at thesaltfix.com, and they can follow me on Twitter, which is Dr. James DiNic, which is DINIC. And I'm also on Facebook. My professional page is Dr. James DiNicolantonio. And I'm on Instagram too.
Okay, amazing. Well, it's been great to chat to you. And thank you so much for all the information and the tips and for opening all our eyes to salt and what it can do for us and the fact that we need to have it. I mean, and that's it. So you've made that really, really clear. I hope that people will go away and really think about their salt intake. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Susie.